Picture yourself standing on a muddy field in 14th century Europe, the air thick with tension and the distant rumble of armored knights advancing toward you. All around, men grip their weapons, hearts pounding, knowing that within moments chaos will erupt and lives will be lost. But in the midst of this impending storm, one group stands apart, not merely armed with bows, but fortified by something far more powerful, an unbreakable code of discipline that would redefine the very nature of warfare. These were the English Longbowmen, ordinary men whose extraordinary mental strength and rigorous training would again and again tilt the scales of battle in favor of the outnumbered and outmatched. We often imagine medieval combat as a clash of steel, strength against strength, hero against hero, but the true story is far more fascinating and far more human. The English longbow itself was a masterpiece of design, capable of firing arrows that could pierce plate armor from hundreds of yards away. Yet without the unwavering discipline of the people who wielded it, the longbow would have been little more than an impressive tool. What made these archers legendary wasn't just their ability to shoot, it was their ability to stand firm, to breathe steadily, to trust one another, and to execute complex commands under the most terrifying conditions imaginable. Their victories were not accidents, they were the result of a culture, a mindset, and a level of preparation that elevated them from mere soldiers to architects of history. In this video, we're going to journey back to an era where focus meant the difference between life and death, where practice was a matter of national pride, and where discipline didn't just support the weapon, it became the weapon. We'll explore how the Longbowmen's Code of Conduct allowed them to reshape battle outcomes across centuries, and we'll uncover lessons that still resonate today in our own pursuit of mastery, resilience, and personal strength. This is more than a history lesson. It's an invitation to rethink what true power looks like and how we might harness that same unwavering discipline in our own lives. To truly grasp the revolutionary impact of the English Longbowmen, we must first understand the instrument that made it all possible. This was no ordinary bow. Crafted from a single, carefully selected stave of yew wood, the longbow stood as tall as the archer himself, often exceeding 6 feet in height. Its design was a masterpiece of medieval material science, utilizing the unique properties of the wood in a brilliant way. The inner heartwood from the tree's core was excellent at handling compression, while the outer sapwood was incredibly resilient under tension. By combining these two natural forces into one elegant weapon, bowwires created a tool of immense power, capable of launching an arrow with enough kinetic energy to penetrate plate armor at distances of over 200 yards. The sound of its release was distinctive too, a deep, resonant thrum that was the audible prelude to a storm of arrows descending upon the enemy. But here's the critical point that is often missed. This technological marvel was entirely dependent on the human element. A powerful bow is useless without a powerful archer to draw it. Historical estimates suggest that drawing a typical war bow required a force of anywhere from 100 to 180 pounds of pressure. This wasn't a strength that could be developed overnight. It was a physical transformation that began in boyhood. Years of dedicated practice were needed to develop the specific muscle groups in the back, shoulders, and arms required to wield this weapon effectively. Skeletons of suspected longbowmen, excavated from medieval burial sites like the Mary Rose shipwreck, tell a silent but powerful story. They show enlarged left arms and stress injuries to the shoulders and wrists, permanent physical markers of a lifetime spent drawing and firing a longbow. The weapon didn't just require strength, it sculpted the very bodies of those who used it. This deep societal integration of archery was no accident. It was actively encouraged and enforced by the English crown, recognizing that a population skilled with the bow was a national strategic asset. Beginning in the 13th century, a series of royal decrees, known as the Assizes of Arms, made weekly archery practice compulsory for all able-bodied men between the ages of 15 and 60. Other laws even banned popular sports like football and handball on Sundays, explicitly to ensure that men would instead focus on honing their skills at the archery butts. Imagine that a government mandating a national pastime for the sake of military readiness. This created a vast, decentralized training ground across the entire country. In every village green and town square, you would find men and boys practicing their craft, not because they were professional soldiers, but because it was simply what was done. It was part of the cultural fabric. This widespread practice created a deep and ready pool of talent. When the king's call to arms went out, he wasn't just recruiting random peasants and handing them a bow. He was summoning men who had already logged thousands of hours of practice. They were farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and tradesmen, but they were also already highly skilled archers. This meant that the transition from civilian to soldier was incredibly swift. The basic proficiency was already there, allowing military commanders to focus their limited training time on drilling these individuals to act as a cohesive, disciplined unit rather than teaching them the fundamentals of how to shoot. The longbow's origins, therefore, are not just found in the forests where the yew was harvested, but in the very laws and daily lives of the English people, who built the foundation for a military revolution one arrow at a time. But to truly understand the Longbowmen, we must look beyond the weapon, and even the laws. We must step into the world they lived in, a world where the bow was woven into the very fabric of daily existence. In medieval England, archery was far more than a military requirement. It was a cornerstone of community life, a source of pride, and a common thread that connected people from all walks of life. Village greens and churchyards across the countryside were rarely empty on Sundays and holidays, as they became arenas for spirited archery competitions. These weren't casual pastimes, they were events where reputations were forged and local heroes were made. Winning such a contest brought immense social prestige, akin to a local athlete winning a championship today. This constant communal practice normalized the bow, transforming it from a tool of war into an extension of the individual, a part of their identity. This cultural immersion began at a remarkably young age. From the time they could walk, boys were given small bows, often crafted by their fathers, and encouraged to mimic the adults. This early start was crucial. It wasn't just about building the specific muscles needed to draw a heavy war bow later in life, though that was certainly a result. More importantly, it was about cultivating a mindset. Handling a bow teaches patience, focus, and quiet determination. There are no shortcuts to accuracy. It demands repetition, self-analysis, and a calm demeanor. A frustrated, impatient archer is a poor archer. So, from childhood, English youth were unconsciously internalizing the very psychological traits that would later define them on the battlefield: immense focus under pressure, and the discipline to execute a complex physical action with precision, regardless of external distractions. This cultural value system created a fascinating social paradox. In much of medieval Europe, the pinnacle of martial prestige was the armored knight on his warhorse, a symbol of noble birth and chivalric virtue. But in England, a yeoman farmer, through sheer skill and dedication with his longbow, could earn a level of respect that transcended his social class. His value was recognized by kings and commoners alike. This elevated the status of discipline and practiced skill to a level nearly equal to that of inherited bravery or noble blood. A man wasn't respected just for being strong or fearless. He was respected for what he could do, for the mastery he had earned through years of consistent effort. This created a society that inherently produced individuals who were not just prepared to fight, but were psychologically and physically conditioned for the specific, demanding role they would play. The culture didn't just produce skilled individuals, it fostered a collective resilience. When these men from different villages were mustered into the king's army, they weren't a random collection of strangers. They shared a common language, not just of words but of action. They all understood the rhythm of drawing a bow, the focus required to aim, and the shared experience of countless hours on the practice range. This created an immediate, unspoken bond and a foundation of mutual understanding. They arrived already speaking the same physical language, which made it infinitely easier for commanders to mold them into a single, unified instrument of war. The cultural backdrop of medieval England, therefore, was the silent, powerful forge that shaped the raw material, the individual archer, long before the military ever applied its own discipline. Mastering the longbow was a lifelong pursuit, a physical and mental transformation that began not in an army camp, but in childhood. The famous English war bow demanded a draw weight modern athletes would find staggering, often exceeding 150 pounds. To develop the necessary strength, boys started young, often with smaller bows, gradually progressing to heavier ones as their bodies adapted. This wasn't occasional play, it was a systematic conditioning of the body. The specific muscle groups required the back, the shoulders. The arms were built through thousands of repetitions, creating the unique skeletal deformities seen in archers' remains, with enlarged left arms and stress injuries to the joints. Strength, however, was only the foundation. The true essence of their training lay in the relentless, monotonous drills. An archer's worth was measured in arrows per minute, and the standard expected was almost unimaginable: a dozen or more aimed shots in 60 seconds. Achieving this rate of fire required flawless, efficient motion. Every movement was broken down and practiced until it was pure instinct, knocking the arrow, drawing the bowstring to the ear, aiming, and releasing in one fluid, explosive motion. They drilled until they could do it blindfolded, until their hands found the arrows by touch alone, until the rhythm of shooting was as natural as breathing. This wasn't just about speed, it was about building an unbreakable muscle memory that would hold firm even when their minds were clouded by the terror and deafening noise of battle. But the preparation went far beyond the archery butts on a sunny afternoon. A key part of their training was acclimatization to hardship and discomfort. Historical records and accounts suggest that archers would practice in driving rain, howling wind, and deep mud. They trained when they were tired, when they were cold, when their muscles ached. This brutal conditioning served a vital purpose: to desensitize them to the miserable conditions of campaign life and the chaos of the battlefield. If you had only ever shot on a calm, clear day, the shock of trying to perform during a storm on a waterlogged field could be paralyzing. By experiencing the worst in training, they ensured that nothing on the day of battle would feel new or insurmountable. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their drill was unit cohesion. An army's archers were not a mob of individual shooters, they were a single, coordinated instrument. They practiced executing mass volleys on command, learning to loose their arrows in unified waves that would blacken the sky. Officers used flags, whistles, and shouted commands to direct this deadly symphony, and each archer learned to listen for these signals over the din of his own heart pounding. This drilled obedience was the difference between a disruptive cloud of arrows and a targeted storm of steel. It meant trusting the command structure completely, firing when ordered without a second thought, and maintaining formation discipline even as enemy knights thundered toward them. This transformation from a skilled individual into a dependable component of a larger machine was the ultimate goal of their relentless training, forging a discipline that was both personal and collective. Now, imagine the sheer chaos of a medieval battlefield, the deafening roar of thousands of men, the thunder of cavalry charges, the blurred confusion of movement and smoke. In that environment, a single archer, no matter how skilled, was virtually powerless. The true strength of the English Longbowmen wasn't just in their individual skill, but in their ability to act as one enormous, coordinated entity. This incredible synchronization was the direct result of a meticulously designed command structure, a system of control so effective it turned a mass of individuals into a single, devastating weapon. While each archer was a master of his craft, it was the unseen network of officers and signals that orchestrated their actions, transforming personal discipline into collective power. This system relied on a clear and efficient hierarchy. At the lowest level, you had small groups of archers, often from the same village or region, led by a trusted veteran known as a vintner, responsible for around 20 men. Above them, the centenar commanded roughly 100 archers, and these officers answered to knights or professional captains who understood the overall battle plan. This chain of command was crucial because it allowed instructions to flow quickly and clearly from the top down, ensuring that every archer from the front line to the back knew what to do and when to do it. There was no room for debate or indecision. The structure was designed for immediate, unquestioning obedience, creating a rhythm and unity that opponents simply could not match. Communication on the noisy battlefield was the system's greatest challenge and its most ingenious solution. With the crash of armor and the screams of the wounded making shouted orders nearly impossible, commanders used a universal language of visual and auditory signals. Flags and banners held high were vital for giving directions over long distances. A specific wave might command a change in targeting, while the dipping of a flag could signal the commencement of a volley. For immediate action, the shrill sound of a whistle was often used, its piercing tone cutting through the din to order the release of arrows. Each archer learned to keep one part of his attention perpetually tuned to these signals, his personal focus on aim seamlessly integrated with an awareness of the group's rhythm. This allowed for complex tactics, like firing in rotating ranks to create a continuous, suffocating hail of arrows that gave the enemy no reprieve. The men chosen to lead were as important as the system itself. These were not noblemen appointed by birthright, but seasoned archers promoted from within the ranks. They had earned their position through proven experience, demonstrated calm under pressure, and an intimate understanding of what their men were capable of and what they were enduring. This fostered a profound sense of mutual trust. The common archer knew his officer had stood where he was standing, had felt the same fear, and had mastered it. In return, the officer led by example, embodying the discipline he demanded. This trust was the glue that held the entire structure together. It meant that when a frightening command was given, like holding fire until the last possible second against a cavalry charge, the men would obey, trusting that their leader's judgment would see them through. Ultimately, this command structure was the great force multiplier. It took the formidable individual power of each longbow and amplified it 1,000-fold through perfect coordination. It freed the archer's mind from the burden of tactical decision-making, allowing him to pour all of his concentration, all of his drilled skill, and all of his discipline into the single act of shooting. He didn't need to wonder when to fire or where to aim. He only needed to listen for the whistle and trust the system. This organizational brilliance meant that the English army could punch far above its weight, leveraging discipline and communication to overcome numerical disadvantages. The command structure didn't just direct the archers, it unlocked their full, terrifying potential, proving that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield is not a tool, but a well-led and perfectly coordinated team. Yet physical strength and drilled precision, as formidable as they were, would have meant little if these men could not control the primal fear that grips every soldier in the heat of combat. The true crucible was not the body, but the mind. To stand your ground as a wall of armored knights thundered toward you, lances lowered, required a level of psychological fortitude that separated the Longbowmen from virtually every other soldier on the medieval battlefield. Their secret weapon was not just the yew-bow, but a deeply ingrained mental conditioning designed to forge unbreakable calm in the midst of sheer terror. This was the invisible armor they wore, and it was just as critical to their success as any piece of steel. This mental training began long before they ever saw an enemy. Veterans would school younger archers in techniques that, centuries later, would be recognized as foundational to modern psychology. They practiced controlled, rhythmic breathing to steady their heart rates and calm their nerves, a method now known to reduce the body's stress response. In the moments before an engagement, you would see rows of men taking these deliberate, measured breaths, consciously lowering their heightened state of arousal and preparing their minds for the task ahead. This simple act was a powerful tool to ward off the panic that could cause a man to fumble his arrow, freeze in place, or break and run. It was a way to reclaim control over their own physiology, turning fear into focused energy. Beyond breathing, they employed visualization. In the quiet moments of camp life, archers were encouraged to mentally rehearse the chaos of battle. They would picture the advancing line, the sound of hooves, the shouted commands, and see themselves executing their duties with flawless precision. This mental simulation served a profound purpose. It desensitized them to the shock of the real event. When the moment finally arrived, it wasn't a completely foreign, overwhelming nightmare. It was a scenario they had already confronted and mastered in their minds countless times. This practice reduced the element of surprise, allowing them to access their trained responses instead of being paralyzed by fear. Many also relied on repetitive mantras or prayers, muttered under their breath as they knocked and drew. These verbal anchors served to focus the mind on a single, familiar point, blocking out the distracting horrors all around them. The words themselves were less important than the rhythmic, calming effect of the repetition, a cognitive trick to maintain a bubble of concentration amidst the din. This focus was the key to their legendary accuracy. While a crossbowman could hide behind a pavise and take slow, deliberate aim, the longbowman's effectiveness depended on maintaining a rapid, sustained rate of fire under extreme duress. His ability to do so was a direct result of this intense psychological conditioning. The ultimate goal of all this training was emotional mastery. The longbowmen were not expected to be unfeeling machines. They were taught to acknowledge their fear but not be ruled by it. They learned to channel the adrenaline surge into their shooting, transforming nervous energy into powerful, controlled releases. This emotional regulation allowed them to perform complex, adaptive maneuvers even as the battle evolved around them. While less disciplined forces might crumble into a disorganized mob when a flank was threatened or a commander fell, the longbowmen could pivot, reposition, and continue their deadly work because their discipline was internal, not just external. Their unshakable demeanor in the face of death became a psychological weapon in its own right, demoralizing enemies who expected a quick rout and instead faced a calm, relentless storm of arrows that never seemed to waver. The fields near Crécy and Ponthieu on August 26, 1346, presented a scene that seemed to guarantee a French victory. The French army, commanded by King Philip VI, was one of the largest and most formidable ever assembled in the Middle Ages, boasting perhaps as many as 30,000 men, including thousands of the most heavily armored knights and Genoese crossbowmen renowned as the finest mercenaries in Europe. Arrayed against them was a much smaller English force, weary from a long campaign of raiding and now dug into a defensive position on a gentle slope. King Edward III of England had perhaps 15,000 men, and at the heart of his strategy were his longbowmen positioned on the flanks. The stage was set for what appeared to be a foregone conclusion, a crushing defeat for the outnumbered invaders. But Crécy would become a brutal lesson in how discipline, preparation, and tactical intelligence could utterly dismantle raw power and numerical superiority. The English choice of terrain was the first masterstroke. Edward positioned his men on a forward slope with a protected rear and a muddy valley in front that would slow any advance. More importantly, he gave his longbowmen a clear, uninterrupted field of fire. As the French army, confident and disorganized, began its advance late in the afternoon, the first to engage were the Genoese crossbowmen. They marched forward and began to loose their bolts, but they were immediately at a disadvantage. A sudden rainstorm had drenched the field earlier, soaking their strings and reducing their weapons' range and power. In stark contrast, the English longbowmen, following their drilled discipline, had simply unstrung their bows to keep the strings dry. They now stood ready, their powerful, dry bows capable of far greater range. The English response was not a scattered reply, but a single, shattering event. On command, thousands of longbowmen raised their bows and released the first of many volleys. The sky literally darkened as a storm of arrows arched over the field and descended upon the Genoese with terrifying force and noise. The crossbowmen, unprepared for this overwhelming barrage, were cut to pieces. Their formation broke, and they began to retreat in disarray, only to be ridden down by the frustrated French knights behind them, who saw their retreat as cowardice. The battle had barely begun, and the French plan was already collapsing into chaos. This is where the longbowmen's drilled discipline faced its ultimate test. The French knights, enraged by the failure of the crossbowmen, began a series of reckless, furious charges up the slippery slope directly into the killing zone of the English archers. The sight would have been enough to break most armies, a solid wall of steel and horseflesh, the flower of French chivalry, thundering uphill with lances lowered, their war cries echoing across the field. Yet the longbowmen held. They did not break, they did not flee. Following the commands of their officers, they switched their aim from the decimated infantry to the advancing cavalry. Their arrows, with their heavy bodkin point tips, were specifically designed for this moment. They couldn't always kill an armored knight outright, but they didn't need to. They wreaked havoc on the horses, piercing their unarmored flanks and bringing down riders in a tangled, screaming mess of metal and flesh. A knight unhorsed in full plate armor was virtually helpless. The arrows also found the weak points in knightly armor: the visor slits, the joints at the arm and neck. The slope became a churning nightmare of fallen animals and men, the subsequent waves of cavalry stumbling over the obstacles created by the first, making them even easier targets for the relentless, rhythmic volleys that never seemed to cease. The French command, trapped by its own chivalric code that valued glorious charges over tactical flexibility, continued to order these suicidal assaults throughout the evening and into the night. Each wave met the same fate. The longbowmen, rotating their lines as they had practiced 1,000 times, maintained their horrific rate of fire. Their muscle memory took over: knock, draw, loose, repeat. Their psychological conditioning allowed them to ignore the carnage in front of them and the terrifying spectacle of each new charge. They trusted their system, their commanders, and each other. Meanwhile, the English men at arms stationed in the center were largely spectators to the slaughter, only stepping in to finish off knights who somehow managed to reach the English lines. By the time the fighting ended, the scale of the French defeat was catastrophic. Thousands of knights and soldiers lay dead on the field, including the blind King John of Bohemia, who had insisted on being tied to his saddle so he could charge into battle one last time. The French army was shattered while English losses were remarkably light. Crécy was far more than a military victory. It was a social and tactical earthquake. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that a highly disciplined force of commoners, armed with a relatively simple weapon, could defeat the most expensive and highly trained aristocratic warriors in Europe. It shattered the myth of knightly invincibility and proved that organization and drill could triumph over individual heroism and brute force. The battle announced the arrival of a new kind of warfare, one where intelligence, logistics, and psychological fortitude were just as important as courage. For the Longbowmen, Crécy was the ultimate validation of every hour spent on the practice range, every drill endured, and every lesson in mental focus. It was the moment theory met the horrific reality of battle and emerged victorious, rewriting the rules of war for the next 100 years and cementing the longbow's legendary status. To understand the devastating effectiveness of the Longbowmen, we must look beyond the archer and his bow to the geometric patterns they formed on the battlefield. These men were not deployed as a simple crowd of shooters. They were arranged with mathematical precision into formations that maximized their firepower and protected their weaknesses. The most common and effective of these was the staggered or checkerboard formation. Imagine looking down on the English line. Instead of one solid block of men, you would see distinct groups of archers positioned with deliberate gaps between them. This was a masterpiece of tactical design. Those gaps were not a vulnerability, they were a killing zone. This layout allowed every archer a clear line of sight and an unobstructed field of fire, ensuring that not a single arrow was wasted. More importantly, it created a crossfire effect. An enemy cavalry charge aiming for one group would find its flanks exposed to the withering volleys from the archers on either side, funneling them into a deadly gauntlet of arrows from multiple angles simultaneously. The true test of this formation came the moment the enemy began their advance. The instinct for any soldier under threat is to bunch together, to seek the psychological safety of a shield wall or a dense mass of comrades. For the Longbowmen, giving into that instinct would have been a death sentence for the entire army. Their discipline was measured in inches and seconds, holding their designated position in the line, maintaining that crucial spacing, and continuing to fire in controlled, rotating volleys. The front ranks would shoot, then momentarily step back to knock another arrow while the second rank stepped forward to loose their own shot, creating a near-constant rolling wave of projectiles. This rotating barrage meant the sky was never clear of arrows. Just as one volley was striking its targets, the next was already in the air. For an advancing knight, it must have felt like trying to run through an endless, steel-tipped hailstorm with no shelter in sight. Maintaining this formation under the thunder of a cavalry charge was perhaps the single greatest act of courage and trust these men performed. They had to believe with every fiber of their being in the system and in the men standing to their left and right. A single break in the line, one group that panicked and fled, would create a fatal gap. This opening would act like a magnet for the enemy, funneling knights directly into the heart of the English position, where they could then wheel and attack the exposed flanks of the other archer groups, causing the entire defensive scheme to unravel catastrophically. The Longbowmen's greatest defense was not a wall of shields, but a wall of discipline. Their faith in their training and their commanders had to be stronger than the primal urge to run from several tons of charging horse and steel. By standing firm, they protected not only themselves but every man in the army. This strategic deployment transformed their weapon from a tool of individual marksmanship into one of area denial and mass disruption. The goal was not necessarily to kill every single knight with a perfectly aimed shot, though that certainly happened, but to break the charge itself. A volley of thousands of arrows raining down en masse would inevitably find its marks in the vulnerable points of the cavalry, the horses. A knight encased in plate armor might be nearly invulnerable to a frontal shot, but his horse was not. A single arrow could bring down a charging destrier, turning the armored rider into a helpless, immobilized target and creating a tripping hazard for the horses behind him. The formation's relentless fire aimed to create a chaotic, bloody barrier of fallen animals and men that would slow, disorganize, and ultimately halt the momentum of the attack. It was a strategy that targeted the enemy's morale and cohesion as much as their bodies, proving that the most powerful weapon on the field was not the longbow itself, but the unbreakable formation of the men who wielded it. While the Longbowmen stood as the visible tip of the spear, their legendary endurance in battle was made possible by an immense, often invisible, machine of supply that stretched all the way back to England itself. An archer in the heat of combat might fire a dozen arrows a minute, and in a major engagement like Agincourt, historians estimate the English army loosed over 500,000 arrows in a single day. Just one archer would carry perhaps 60 to 70 arrows into battle, meaning his personal supply would be exhausted in a matter of minutes. Without a relentless, disciplined system of resupply, the army's primary weapon would have fallen silent almost immediately, rendering the Longbowmen utterly powerless. The entire strategy hinged on a logistical miracle, the ability to keep this torrent of arrows flowing from the rear to the front lines without pause, a task that required foresight, organization, and an army of unsung support personnel. The journey of a single war arrow was a testament to this complex supply chain. It began in the dense forests of England, where laws protected the valuable yew and ash trees needed for bows and arrows. Specialist craftsmen, known as fletchers and arrowsmiths, worked year-round, often in centralized workshops, mass-producing arrows to strict government standards. These were not crude sticks, they were sophisticated munitions. Each arrow required a carefully straightened shaft, precisely fitted steel arrowheads, often of the armor-piercing bodkin type, and 3 goose feathers for fletching, cut and glued to induce a stabilizing spin in flight. This was England's medieval military-industrial complex, producing arrows by the hundreds of thousands, which were then bundled into barrels, 24 to a sheaf, for transport and protection from the elements. Getting these vital supplies across the English Channel and then through the war-torn French countryside to a moving army was the quartermaster's monumental challenge. This involved a fleet of ships for the initial crossing, and then a long, vulnerable train of wagons, carts, and pack horses for the overland journey. These convoys were prime targets for enemy raids, meaning they required their own armed guards, further complicating the logistics. The quartermasters, the masterminds of this operation, had to possess an almost prophetic ability to anticipate need. They calculated consumption rates based on projected battle sizes, planned routes that avoided enemy strongholds, and established forward supply dumps ahead of the army's advance. Their work was a constant race against time and distance, ensuring that the army never outran its lifeline. Once with the army, the system shifted to a finely tuned distribution network. During a battle, young pages and dedicated baggage handlers, themselves operating under intense pressure, would race between the supply wagons and the archer formations, sheaves of fresh arrows slung over their shoulders. They had to know exactly which unit needed resupply and when, navigating the chaotic and dangerous battlefield to deliver their cargo directly into the hands of the archers. This moment of resupply was a critical vulnerability. A break in the flow, even for a few minutes, could create a deadly lull in the arrow storm that an enemy could exploit. The seamless hand-off of arrows from page to archer was a drilled procedure as important as the drawing of the bowstring itself. Beyond arrows, the system also had to provide for the maintenance of the bows. A broken bowstring in the middle of a volley could sideline an archer just as effectively as a lack of arrows. Spare strings, coils of hemp or flax, and wax for waterproofing were all critical supplies. Bowstaves themselves could crack or warp, requiring replacements to be on hand. This logistical discipline extended to the archer's personal needs as well: food, clean water, and medical supplies. An army, as the old adage goes, marches on its stomach, but it fights on its supply lines. The confidence this system gave the Longbowmen cannot be overstated. They could pour all of their concentration and energy into the fight, secure in the knowledge that the material means to continue would be there. This unwavering faith in their support system was the final, crucial layer of their discipline, freeing them from the anxiety of scarcity and allowing them to focus solely on the task of winning the battle. Beyond the drilled formations and the relentless volleys lay an invisible force that bound the Longbowmen together, a force arguably more powerful than any command structure, a deeply ingrained code of honor. This wasn't a formal set of rules written on parchment for knights. It was an unwritten, universally understood ethos that governed their conduct. At its heart was an unshakable loyalty, not just to the distant king, but to the man standing next to you in the line, the vintner who led your 20, and the collective identity of the archer corps. This sense of brotherhood was forged in the shared hardships of campaign life and the mutual dependence that defined their survival. Letting down your comrades was a sin far greater than any personal failure of skill, a transgression that carried the heaviest of penalties, social ostracization, and the permanent loss of respect. This ethical framework was actively reinforced through powerful rituals that cemented their elite status. Upon being mustered into the king's service, archers would often swear oaths, not in a grand castle hall, but among themselves, pledging to stand firm and uphold the honor of their unit. They shared distinctive badges and symbols like the Red Cross of St. George worn on their tunics, which served as a constant, visible reminder of their shared purpose and identity. This created a powerful, in-group mentality. They weren't just soldiers, they were part of a select fraternity defined by a common skill and a shared set of values. This collective pride made the prospect of cowardice or desertion almost unthinkable, not merely because of the legal punishment, but because it would be a profound betrayal of the very men who relied on you. A practical manifestation of this code was a culture of fierce mutual accountability. In the tight-knit groups they lived and fought in, every man was his brother's keeper. There was no room for the selfish individualism that could cripple a unit. If one archer's equipment was damaged, others would help repair it. If a man was struggling, he was supported, not scorned. This created an environment where peer pressure was a powerful force for good, encouraging everyone to meet the high standards the group set for itself. A man who showed fear was not mocked, but steadied by the calm example of those around him. This network of support was the emotional bedrock that allowed them to face unimaginable terror without breaking. This reputation for unwavering reliability became a strategic asset in itself. English commanders could devise complex, daring tactics specifically because they trusted the Longbowmen to execute them without question. Opponents, too, learned to respect this quality. Facing the English army meant not just facing a weapon, but facing a unified body of men who were notoriously difficult to intimidate, bribe, or break. Their word was their bond, and their steadfastness was a known quantity on the chaotic chessboard of medieval warfare. This granted them a psychological advantage before the first arrow was even nocked, as enemies anticipated a fight against a disciplined, resolute foe rather than a disorderly mob. Ultimately, this moral compass ensured that their formidable discipline was not a temporary performance for battle, but a permanent aspect of their character. It governed their behavior in camp, on the march, and in interactions with the local populace they were meant to protect or garrison. It was the inner compass that guided them when officers weren't watching, the reason they didn't pillage indiscriminately or desert at the first sign of hardship. This integrity is what transformed them from mere hired hands into true professionals, men who took profound pride in their craft and their conduct, understanding that their greatest weapon was not the yew bow they carried, but the collective trust they had built and were duty-bound to uphold. This reputation for unwavering discipline might conjure an image of robotic rigidity, of men programmed to execute a single, unchangeable plan. But the true genius of the Longbowmen lay in a far more sophisticated quality, their remarkable adaptability. Their profound mastery of drills and commands did not chain them to a single tactic. Instead, it gifted them the freedom to innovate in the heat of battle. Because every archer knew the core playbook by heart, they could collectively pivot to a new strategy with breathtaking speed and cohesion, responding to the fluid chaos of the battlefield not with confusion, but with a calm, practiced creativity that left their enemies bewildered and outmaneuvered. This tactical flexibility was most evident in their ability to instantly switch their mode of fire based on the immediate threat. The standard and most feared tactic was the mass volley, a blanket of arrows arcing high into the sky to fall upon a broad area. This was devastating against massed infantry or cavalry formations, but what happened when the enemy adapted, perhaps by dispersing their ranks or sending fast-moving skirmishers to harass the flanks? The Longbowmen could seamlessly transition from area saturation to precision targeting. On a shouted command or a specific flag signal, they would shift from high-angle volleys to direct, flat trajectory shots. This required a completely different aim point and judgment of distance, a skill they possessed thanks to their varied training. They could focus their fire on a specific unit, a high-value target like an enemy commander, or even the vulnerable horses of a nightly charge, surgically dismantling the most dangerous part of the enemy's plan without any loss of coordination or rate of fire. Their adaptability extended beyond their shooting to their physical positioning on the field. Medieval battles were not static affairs. The lines ebbed and flowed, and weaknesses appeared in an instant. A key French tactic, for instance, was to send heavily armored dismounted knights on a direct assault against the English men at arms in the center, hoping to break through with sheer weight. When this happened, the Longbowmen didn't just stand on the flanks and continue shooting into the crowded melee, risking hitting their own comrades. Instead, they would often fluidly reposition, sometimes even advancing to enfilade the sides of the French assault, pouring arrows into the exposed flanks of the advancing men. This movement was not a panicked scramble. It was a rehearsed maneuver executed by units at the direction of their officers. They could create killing zones from new angles, exploiting a momentary gap in the enemy's attention and turning a localized infantry battle into a devastating trap. This capacity for rapid change was made possible by the very command structure that seemed so rigid. The clear hierarchy and universal understanding of signals acted as a shared language that enabled complex information to be conveyed instantly. An officer spotting a developing opportunity or threat didn't need to send a runner with a lengthy explanation. He could raise a specific flag or sound a series of whistle blasts that every archer in his command understood. This meant the entire unit could change its behavior, its target, its firing solution, or even its location, in a matter of seconds. The enemy, often reliant on shouted orders that were lost in the din or on the slow movement of banners that were difficult to see, would suddenly find themselves facing a completely different tactical problem without understanding how or why it had happened. This fusion of drilled discipline and creative adaptability made the Longbowmen the most unpredictable and frustrating opponents on the medieval battlefield. They defied the conventional wisdom of the time, which often valued glorious, straightforward charges. French knights trained for direct chivalric combat found themselves battling a force that refused to play by the established rules. Just when they thought they had understood the English tactic, a relentless hail of arrows from a fixed position, the Longbowmen would change the game. They might feign a retreat to draw a charge into a pre-prepared killing zone, or they might suddenly concentrate their entire firepower on a single point to collapse a section of the enemy line. This intellectual flexibility, born from absolute confidence in their training and their leaders, demonstrated that the highest form of discipline is not mindless obedience, but the cultivated ability to think collectively under pressure, to turn the chaos of war into a canvas for their own relentless innovation. At first glance, the crossbow seemed like the superior weapon of the medieval era. It was a marvel of engineering, a machine that could be mastered with relative ease. A soldier could be trained to operate a crossbow effectively in a matter of weeks, not the decades required for the longbow. Its mechanism, a latch that held the string in place until released by a trigger, meant it demanded far less raw physical strength. A crossbowman didn't need the specific, heavily developed musculature. He could use a cranequin or a goat's foot lever to draw the string mechanically, then hold it ready to fire indefinitely, patiently waiting for the perfect shot. It was the era's precision instrument, capable of incredible accuracy and immense power at a shorter range, and it didn't care if its user was a seasoned veteran or a hastily trained conscript. From a purely technological standpoint, it appeared to be the future. But this technological advantage came with a crippling tactical drawback: speed. The very process that made the crossbow easy to use also made it painfully slow. Reloading was a multi-step, laborious chore. After firing, the crossbowman had to unhook his cranequin, reattach it to the string, crank it back with a series of rotations until the latch clicked into place, then lift a new bolt from his quiver and lay it into the groove. This process could take 30 seconds or even a full minute under the stress of combat. This slowness dictated their entire method of fighting. Crossbowmen were almost always deployed behind large, heavy shields called pavises, which were planted into the ground to form a protective wall. They would fire, then duck behind this shield to reload in safety, peeking out only to take their next carefully aimed shot. This made them a static, defensive force lethal snipers, but utterly dependent on their protective barrier and unable to advance or maneuver effectively while maintaining their rate of fire. The longbow, in stark contrast, was a masterpiece of human performance. Its technology was not in gears and latches, but in the years of ingrained training and disciplined physiology of the archer. Where the crossbow was slow and deliberate, the longbow was a weapon of overwhelming tempo and volume. A trained longbowman could launch 10, 12, even 15 aimed shots in a single minute. This wasn't just shooting, it was a sustained barrage, a continuous storm of arrows that saturated the sky and ground alike. This rate of fire created a psychological effect far beyond the physical damage. Facing a crossbow volley meant facing a periodic, deadly thwack of bolts. Facing the English longbow meant living under an endless, terrifying hailstorm where the air itself seemed to be made of whining death, with no pause, no reprieve, and no predictable rhythm. The constant noise and the sight of the sky darkening were weapons in themselves, designed to shatter morale and break formations before they even made contact. This fundamental difference in tempo created a dramatic divergence in battlefield roles and vulnerability. The longbowmen were fluid and mobile. They could advance, retreat, and shift positions to exploit new angles, all while maintaining their devastating output. They were their own protection, using the sheer volume of their fire to suppress and eliminate threats at a distance. The crossbowman, tethered to his pavise, was a sitting duck. If his shield wall was breached or flanked, if he was caught in the open, or if he was forced to move, his effectiveness plummeted to zero. He was defenseless during the long reload. At the Battle of Crécy, this contrast was laid brutally bare. The Genos crossbowmen, the finest mercenaries of their day, found their strings slack from the rain and their reloading pace utterly overwhelmed by the English arrow storm. They were cut down not because their weapons were inferior, but because their system of war could not compete with the relentless, disciplined tempo of the longbow. Ultimately, the longbow versus crossbow debate is a timeless lesson about the relationship between tools and the people who wield them. The crossbow represents a path of technological substitution, using a machine to reduce the skill and training required for a task. It placed its faith in the engineering of the weapon itself. The longbow represents a path of human amplification using intense, cultural discipline to unlock the full potential of a simple tool. It placed its faith in the training and fortitude of the individual. The English victory in this centuries-long arms race proved a profound truth. A superior mindset, cultivated through years of dedication and drilled into a cohesive system, will almost always triumph over a superior piece of technology in the hands of the less prepared. The longbow didn't win battles because it was a better piece of wood. It won because it was the physical expression of a better, more disciplined society. While the image of the longbowmen unleashing a relentless offensive barrage is iconic, their true professionalism was perhaps most starkly revealed in the moments when everything was going wrong. For most medieval armies, a retreat was not a tactic. It was a prelude to a massacre, a chaotic unraveling where discipline evaporated and every man fled for himself, only to be cut down from behind. The longbowmen, however, transformed this moment of supreme vulnerability into a practiced, lethal ballet. Their training encompassed not just how to win, but how to survive a setback without crumbling, a capability that made them a persistent and resilient threat campaign after campaign. The key to their defensive discipline was the concept of the fighting withdrawal. This was not a frantic run for the rear, but a controlled, step-by-step maneuver where the entire unit moved backwards while still facing the enemy. The most critical element was maintaining formation. Archers would retreat in ranks, with those in the front line firing a volley to suppress the advancing enemy before turning to move quickly through the gaps in the line behind them. That second rank would then become the new front, ready to loose their own covering volley, creating a rhythmic, rolling retreat that presented a continuous wall of arrows to the pursuers. This required incredible trust and spatial awareness. Each man had to know exactly where his comrades were, moving with precision to avoid tripping or creating a gap that could be exploited. Covering fire was the linchpin of this entire operation. The volleys weren't aimed for maximum kills but for maximum disruption, to force the enemy to duck, to slow their advance, to make them hesitant to charge into a constant stream of projectiles. Even while moving backwards, the longbowmen maintained their legendary rate of fire. This created a deadly buffer zone between them and their pursuers, a space that was suicidal for any enemy soldier to enter. It turned the tables psychologically. The pursuing force, expecting an easy route, instead found themselves having to advance directly into the same arrow storm that had decimated them earlier. Only now the source of that storm was moving away in good order. This often caused the enemy charge to lose its momentum and cohesion, as frustration and caution replaced the initial bloodlust. This drilled expertise in defensive actions also extended to protecting other parts of the army. If the men at arms in the center needed to fall back, the longbowmen on the flanks would intensify their fire to cover the retreat, pinning down enemy forces and preventing them from swarming the vulnerable infantry. They acted as the army's protective shield, using their range and discipline to create breathing room and allow for a reorganization of the battle line. This interoperability was only possible because of their ingrained discipline. They could shift their focus instantly from offensive support to defensive screening without any loss of coordination, understanding that preserving the army's overall strength was more important than holding a single piece of ground. This mastery of the retreat made the English army incredibly difficult to finish off. Even in a tactical loss, they could extract a heavy price from the victors and live to fight another day with their core force largely intact. While other armies might be annihilated in a single defeat, the English could retreat, regroup, and return, their confidence unbroken because they had proven to themselves that they could handle a crisis without panic. This defensive resilience, this ability to turn a potential disaster into an orderly withdrawal, was the final, and in many ways most sophisticated, layer of their discipline. It ensured that their legacy was built not just on glorious victories, but on a sustained and enduring effectiveness that wore down their enemies through sheer professionalism and grit. For knights raised on a strict code of chivalry, the experience of facing the English longbowmen was not just terrifying, it was profoundly disorienting and insulting. Medieval warfare for the aristocratic class was built on a foundation of personal honor, recognizable opponents, and hand-to-hand combat where bravery and skill could be displayed and celebrated. A knight expected to see the face of the man he fought, to exchange challenges, and to earn glory through individual prowess. The longbowmen completely subverted this entire worldview. Their weapon was impersonal, anonymous, and death arrived from 100 yards away, delivered by a commoner whose face you would never see. There was no glory in being killed by a yard-long arrow that came whistling out of the sky. It was an ignoble, random, and deeply demoralizing way to die, stripping away the very essence of what a nobleman believed combat should be. The sensory assault alone was enough to unravel the composure of the most seasoned warriors. Before the arrows even began to strike, you would hear it, a low, collective thrum of hundreds of bows releasing simultaneously, a sound that one chronicler likened to a monstrous, infernal humming. Then would come the sight, a phenomenon that numerous accounts describe with a kind of horrified awe. The sky literally darkening as a thick cloud of arrows arched high into the air, blotting out the sun before beginning their terrifying descent. This visual and auditory preview meant that soldiers had to endure several seconds of dreadful anticipation, watching their death approach from above with no means of escape. The psychological toll of waiting for that steel-tipped hail to fall, knowing it would arrive in an unstoppable wave, caused many to break formation instinctively, ducking, raising shields uselessly, or simply freezing in place, their forward momentum shattered before a single casualty was taken. This relentless tempo was the true heart of the psychological attack. A crossbow volley was a distinct event, a single, sharp release of bolts followed by a long pause for reloading. It was a rhythm that allowed for brief moments of mental recovery. the Longbowmen offered no such respite. Their volleys were continuous, a rolling, endless storm where the next cloud of arrows was already in the air before the first had even found its mark. This created a state of sustained terror and sensory overload. There was no pause to regroup, no lull to tend to the wounded, no opportunity to rally wavering troops. The constant screaming whistle of arrows and the thudding impact on shields, earth, and flesh created a wall of noise that drowned out the commands of officers, leading to confusion and a catastrophic breakdown in communication. Units became isolated, plans were forgotten, and the army devolved into a collection of frightened individuals rather than a cohesive fighting force. The demoralization was compounded by the gruesome and chaotic nature of the wounds. An armored knight might be safe from a direct kill, but the horses were not. The battlefield quickly became a hellish landscape of screaming, dying animals, thrashing on the ground and creating treacherous obstacles for the following ranks. A knight thrown from his saddle in full plate armor was utterly helpless, a turtle on its back waiting to be dispatched. The arrows also had a macabre tendency to find the tiny gaps in armor, the visor slit, the armpit, the back of the knee. Seeing the most heavily armored and supposedly invulnerable men in the army fall to a single, unseen shot from a distance fundamentally undermined the confidence of everyone around them. If a knight in full plate could be killed so arbitrarily, what hope did a common foot soldier with a leather jerkin have? This sense of inevitable, random doom was a poison that spread rapidly through the ranks. The ultimate psychological victory of the Longbowmen was forcing their enemies to make catastrophic, fear-driven mistakes. Impressive, well-rehearsed battle plans were abandoned in minutes. Cavalry charges, the pinnacle of medieval military power, were often launched prematurely, out of frustration and a desperate desire to close the distance and make the archers fight fairly. These charges, however, were then funneled into the pre-prepared killing zones and shot to pieces. Commanders, seeing their vaunted knights falling in heaps, would frequently commit their reserves too early in a panicked attempt to stabilize the situation, only to see those fresh troops meet the same fate. The disciplined, silent pressure exerted by the Longbowmen didn't just kill soldiers. It systematically dismantled the enemy command's ability to think clearly, turning seasoned generals into reactive, frightened leaders who sacrificed their advantages in a desperate bid to stop the noise, the death, and the terrifying, impersonal storm that was methodically tearing their army apart. The true brilliance of the English military system lay not in the isolated power of the longbow, but in its masterful orchestration within a combined arms framework. These archers were never intended to be a standalone force. They were the crucial keystone that connected and empowered every other element on the battlefield. Their profound discipline was the glue that allowed this diverse military machine to operate with a terrifying synergy, where the whole became infinitely greater than the sum of its parts. Imagine a medieval battle line not as a simple wall of shields, but as a dynamic, interlocking puzzle. The men-at-arms, heavily armored knights and infantry, formed the anvil, a solid defensive core designed to absorb and hold the enemy's main assault. The Longbowmen were the hammer, a mobile and devastating force that could smash the enemy against that anvil from a distance. But for this to work, the timing and coordination had to be flawless, a dance of death rehearsed through shared purpose and mutual trust. This seamless integration was most critical in the moments of advance and assault. When the English men-at-arms moved forward to engage the enemy line, they did not do so under a sporadic shower of friendly arrows. That would have been a recipe for disaster. Instead, the Longbowmen provided what modern military doctrine calls suppressing fire. They would lay down a concentrated, continuous barrage just ahead of the advancing infantry. creating a literal curtain of steel that pinned the enemy down, forced them to keep their heads behind their shields, and prevented them from effectively organizing a countercharge or launching their own missiles. This allowed the English infantry to close the distance with minimal losses, arriving at the enemy line not winded and depleted from dodging spears and arrows, but fresh and ready for the close quarters fight. The trust required here was absolute. The infantry had to believe the archers would maintain their precise range and lift their fire at the exact moment of contact, while the archers had to have faith that the infantry would advance swiftly and decisively into the gap they created. The same principle applied to the army's most vulnerable points, its flanks. In any battle formation, the sides and rear are perpetually exposed to encircling maneuvers. Cavalry was typically tasked with protecting these flanks, but even the best horsemen could be overwhelmed by a determined enemy push. This is where the longbowmen's mobility and range became a game changer. They could be rapidly repositioned to shore up a threatened flank, creating an instant, impenetrable barrier of arrows that would break up any attempted encirclement. A charging enemy unit aiming to roll up the English line would suddenly find itself funneled into a killing zone, taking devastating casualties from the side before it could even make contact with the main force. This defensive flexibility made the entire army incredibly resilient and difficult to outmaneuver, as any attempt to exploit a weakness was met with a disciplined, lethal response. This legendary interoperability didn't happen by accident on the day of battle. It was the product of a shared culture of professionalism and, crucially, shared practice. Unlike many medieval armies that were hastily assembled collections of feudal levies with little common training, the English forces often campaigned together for years. The longbowmen, men-at-arms, and cavalry would drill not just as individual units, but as a combined team. They practiced the timing of advances under covering fire, the signals for shifting targets, and the coordinated maneuvers for defending flanks. They developed a common language of battle, built on a foundation of respect. The knight learned to value the low-born archer who could clear his path to glory, and the archer gained confidence from the knowledge that the armored nobility would steadfastly hold the line he was protecting. This cultivated mutual dependence forged a unique esprit de corps, transforming a collection of different troop types into a single, unified, and formidable instrument of war, where every soldier understood his role in a much larger and deadlier picture. We often picture the longbowmen's expertise being passed down like a family recipe from father to son on the village green, a tradition sustained by word of mouth and lived experience. While this was certainly the foundation, the English crown recognized that to build a truly national military asset, this knowledge needed to be more than folklore. It needed to be systemized, standardized, and scaled. This revolutionary leap was achieved through the creation and dissemination of official training manuals and royal ordinances. These weren't mere suggestions. They were the blueprints for building and maintaining a disciplined fighting force, transforming individual skill into a reproducible system of national defense. The most famous of these decrees were the Assizes of Arms, a series of laws that began in the 13th century and were repeatedly reinforced by monarchs like Edward I and Edward III. These weren't vague calls to patriotism. They were incredibly specific, legally enforceable mandates. They dictated that every able-bodied man between the ages of 15 and 60 was required by law to own a bow suited to his strength and to practice with it every single week, often under the supervision of local officials. The laws even went so far as to ban other popular leisure activities, like football and handball, on Sundays to ensure that men would have no excuse to skip their archery practice. This was a government-mandated national training program, centuries before the concept even existed. designed to create a deep and constantly refreshed pool of talent from which the army could draw. But these ordinances went far beyond just ordering people to practice. They codified the very ethos of the Longbowmen. They detailed the expected moral conduct, emphasizing the values of loyalty, obedience, and steady courage. They outlined the standards for equipment, specifying the types of wood, the length of the bowstave, and even the quality of the arrowheads, ensuring a uniformity of gear that was vital for reliable resupply in the field. Perhaps most importantly, they institutionalized the training regimens we discussed earlier. The manuals would describe the drills, the distances for the practice butts, and the rate of fire to be achieved, creating a common standard of excellence that was expected from Cornwall to Northumberland. A young man in a remote village now had a clear, state-sponsored benchmark to strive for, a defined path to becoming a soldier worthy of the king's service. This shift from oral tradition to written doctrine was a monumental development. It meant that the collective wisdom of veteran archers, the best techniques for drawing the bow, the most effective maintenance routines for wet weather, the psychological tricks for managing fear could be captured, refined, and distributed across the entire kingdom. It prevented knowledge from being lost with each generation or isolated in certain regions. A new captain, appointed to raise a company of archers, didn't have to rely solely on his own limited experience. He could refer to the ordinances to understand exactly how to train his men, what to expect of them, and how to integrate them into the larger army structure. This created a remarkable consistency in quality, ensuring that a longbowman recruited from Devon would be trained to the same exacting standard as one from Yorkshire. The existence of these detailed manuals reveals a sophisticated and deliberate military philosophy. It shows a clear understanding that winning wars was not just about having weapons or even willing men, but about having a systematically trained and disciplined force. The English monarchy wasn't just summoning archers, it was building a system, an institution. By putting these practices into writing, they ensured that the high standards of the Longbowmen were not a temporary peak achieved by one brilliant commander, but a sustainable, renewable resource that could be relied upon for generations. These documents were the tangible manifestation of a national commitment to discipline, proving that the true secret to the longbow's success was not just in the wood and the muscle, but in the ink and the law that organized it all. The legendary discipline of the Longbowmen was forged not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, monotonous routines of camp life. While their skill with the bow was their most visible asset, their true strength was a comprehensive professionalism that governed every waking moment, transforming a collection of individuals into a cohesive, resilient community. A medieval military camp was a notoriously dangerous place, often more deadly than the battlefield itself. Dysentery, typhus, and other camp diseases could decimate an army without a single arrow being loosed. Desertion was a constant threat, especially for forces operating for years in foreign lands, far from home and any tangible reward. The English commanders understood that to keep their most valuable weapon, the archer, effective, they had to master the art of living, not just the art of fighting. This began with an almost fanatical emphasis on camp hygiene, a concept far ahead of its time. Longbowmen were drilled in the setup of their temporary homes with a precision that mirrored their battlefield formations. Latrines were dug at a mandated and specific distance downstream from the main water source, with strict rules for their use and maintenance. Refuse pits for food waste were designated and regularly filled in to deter scavengers and the pests they brought. While they wouldn't have understood germ theory, their practical experience had taught them that clean camps meant healthier soldiers. This enforced cleanliness was a powerful disciplinary act. It required men who were exhausted from a day's march to still perform these mundane chores. instilling a sense of collective responsibility for the group's well-being that directly translated to mutual dependence in combat. Equally rigorous were the nightly rituals of equipment maintenance. After a day's march or engagement, a longbowman's first duty was not to rest but to care for his gear. This was a matter of survival. The powerful yew bowstave was meticulously inspected for any hairline cracks or splinters, then gently rubbed down with wax or tallow to keep it supple and protected from moisture. Bowstrings, the most vulnerable part of the weapon, were immediately unstrung and carefully stored in a personal kit, often wrapped in waxed cloth to keep them dry and ready for instant use. Arrows were recovered, cleaned, and straightened if possible. A broken string or a warped arrow in the middle of a volley was not just an individual problem, it was a breach in the unit's collective firepower. This nightly maintenance ritual was a tangible, physical expression of their discipline, a constant reaffirmation that their lives and the lives of their comrades depended on the reliability of their tools. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their off-duty discipline was the active cultivation of camaraderie. Commanders and veteran officers encouraged structured social activities to strengthen the bonds between men. Games of skill, wrestling matches, and of course, impromptu archery competitions were common features of camp life. These activities served a dual purpose. They provided a necessary release from the immense stress of campaign life, but they also reinforced the same skills and rivalries that made them effective warriors. Sharing rations, singing songs, and telling stories around a fire built the trust that was essential for holding the line when fear threatened to take over. This fostered an environment where a man was less likely to desert because he would be abandoning his friends, and less likely to shirk his duties because he would be letting down his band of brothers. This sense of belonging was a powerful bulwark against the loneliness and despair that could cripple an army's morale. The rhythm of the march itself was a test of this ingrained discipline. Moving thousands of men across hundreds of miles of medieval countryside was a logistical nightmare fraught with peril. Strict rules governed the order of march, the spacing between units, and the conduct of men while on the move. Pillaging local villages was often harshly punished, not out of a sudden sense of chivalry, but for brutally practical reasons. Uncontrolled looting could spark local rebellions, deny the army future supplies, and slow its progress to a crawl. By maintaining strict march discipline and orderly conduct, the longbowmen ensured the army could move swiftly and efficiently, living off the land without completely burning its goodwill. This operational professionalism meant they arrived at the battlefield not as a ragged, exhausted mob, but as a rested, supplied, and still cohesive fighting force, their discipline intact and their focus sharp, ready to unleash the storm that their camp life had so carefully preserved. This culture of mentorship began the moment a new recruit, often a young man who had practiced on his village green since boyhood, joined a company of veteran archers. He wasn't just handed a bow and assigned a place in the line. He was adopted into a system of learning that was both practical and profoundly personal. An experienced archer, a grizzled veteran who had survived multiple campaigns, would take the newcomer under his wing. The first lessons weren't about how to shoot. That skill was already there, but about how to survive. The veteran would show him how to properly wax his bowstring to keep it dry in the rain, how to inspect a bowstave for hidden cracks that could spell disaster in the middle of a volley, and how to carefully straighten recovered arrows to make every shot count. This transfer of mundane, life-saving knowledge was the first brick in building a relationship of trust and respect, establishing that the veteran's wisdom extended far beyond the battlefield. The technical skills were refined through this master-apprentice dynamic. A newcomer might be strong and accurate, but a veteran could teach him the subtle efficiencies that made all the difference during a long engagement. The most economical motion for nocking an arrow to save precious seconds, the slight adjustment in aim to account for a crosswind, or the way to distribute his weight to maintain stability on muddy ground. These were nuances that could only be learned from someone who had faced every conceivable condition and knew the tricks that separated a competent archer from an exceptional one. This wasn't taught in a formal classroom. It was shared in the quiet moments of camp life through demonstration and quiet correction, ensuring that the collective wisdom of the entire corps was continually passed down and refined with each new generation. Beyond the physical techniques, the most critical thing a mentor passed on was the right mindset. A young archer's greatest enemy wasn't the French knight across the field. It was the fear gnawing at his own resolve. Veterans taught the psychological tools of the trade, the breathing exercises to steady a racing heart, the importance of focusing on the immediate command rather than the overwhelming chaos, and the mental trick of narrowing your world down to the simple rhythm of knock, draw, and loose. They would share stories of past battles, not to glorify war, but to normalize the terror, to show that fear was a universal experience that could be managed and mastered. This emotional coaching was invaluable, transforming raw, nervous energy into focused, disciplined action, and assuring the newcomer that the calm demeanor of the veterans wasn't innate courage, but a learned skill he too could acquire. The leaders themselves, from the vinterners commanding 20 men to the knights overseeing entire divisions, understood that their most powerful tool was their own example. They knew that words were cheap, but actions were undeniable. A commander who remained visibly calm while giving orders as enemy cavalry advanced, whose voice was steady and whose instructions were clear, did more for his men's morale than any inspirational speech. He demonstrated that discipline was possible even in the most extreme circumstances, making it a tangible, achievable reality for every archer under his command. This leadership by example created a powerful culture of mutual accountability. Men were far less likely to falter when they saw their respected leader embodying the very resolve he demanded from them. This entire structure of mentorship and leadership created a self-sustaining cycle of excellence. The newcomer, molded by his veterans, would eventually become a veteran himself, instinctively taking on the role of mentor for the next wave of recruits. The attitudes, the techniques, and the unwritten code of conduct were perpetuated organically, creating a living tradition that was resistant to the constant turnover of individuals in a dangerous profession. This ensured that the Longbowmen's effectiveness wasn't dependent on a single brilliant commander or a unique group of individuals. It was baked into the very culture of the units themselves. The glue that held this formidable disciplinary framework together wasn't fear of punishment, but the powerful bonds of respect, shared experience, and a deeply ingrained commitment to ensuring that every man who stood in the line was as prepared and resilient as the one beside him. It's tempting to view the Longbowmen as a relic of a distant past, their methods rendered obsolete by the relentless march of technology. Yet, if we listen closely to the lessons echoing from those medieval fields, we discover a startling truth. The core principles of their discipline are not just historical curiosities. They are a timeless blueprint for excellence that resonates powerfully in our modern world. The weapons have changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental human elements required to wield them effectively, the rigorous training, the psychological fortitude, and the seamless organizational cohesion remain strikingly consistent, especially within the world's most elite modern military units. Consider the training regimen of a contemporary Special Forces soldier. Just as a Longbowman's transformation began in childhood on the village green, A Navy SEAL or SAS operative endures a selection process so physically and mentally grueling that it is designed not to train, but to identify and eliminate those who lack the supreme resilience required. This is not about learning to use a new piece of technology. It is about forging an individual's character. The endless hours of physical exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and constant psychological pressure in places like BUD/S or selection are the modern equivalent of the Longbowmen's daily drill in rain and mud. The goal is identical: to instill a level of muscle memory and mental toughness so deep that it becomes an unshakable default, allowing the soldier to perform complex tasks perfectly even when their body is screaming in protest and their mind is clouded by fear and fatigue. The technology in their hands is cutting edge, but the process of preparing the human being to use it is ancient. This parallel extends powerfully into the psychological realm. The Longbowmen used controlled breathing and visualization to steady their nerves against a charging knight. Today's special operators employ scientifically refined techniques like box breathing and mindfulness under the banner of tactical performance psychology. They are trained in emotional regulation and stress inoculation, learning to recognize the physiological signs of panic, the racing heart, the tunnel vision, and to apply conscious control to override them. This mental armor allows a modern sniper to steady his aim and control his breath after a long, physically demanding infiltration, just as it allowed a longbowman to execute a smooth draw while a wall of steel thundered toward him. The enemy and the environment are different, but the internal battle against primal fear is exactly the same, and the discipline required to win it is unchanged. Perhaps the most profound similarity lies in the concept of organizational cohesion and trust. The Longbowmen's effectiveness was multiplied 100-fold by their ability to act as a single, coordinated entity through a clear command structure. Modern elite units take this to its logical extreme. Using advanced digital radios and satellite communications, a small team on the ground can coordinate its actions with air support, drone operators, and command centers halfway around the globe. Yet, this high-tech network is worthless without the same bedrock of trust and drilled obedience that define the Longbowmen. Each operator must have absolute faith that his teammate will cover his sector, that the drone pilot thousands of miles away has the right visual, and that the command decision made in a remote ops center is correct. This trust is not born from the technology itself, but from the countless hours of shared, realistic training that builds an unspoken language and a collective intuition. The high-tech tools are merely the conduits for a form of human trust and coordination that would be instantly familiar to a vintner on the field at Agincourt. This enduring relevance powerfully demonstrates a crucial, often overlooked truth in our technology-obsessed age. The human factor is, and always will be, the ultimate determinant of success. A military can possess the most advanced drones, the most sophisticated cyber capabilities, and the most powerful weapons systems, but if the individuals operating them lack discipline, resilience, and the ability to function as a cohesive unit, that technological advantage can be swiftly neutralized. The Longbowmen proved that a simple weapon in the hands of supremely disciplined individuals could defeat the most advanced military technology of their day, the heavily armored knight. Today's conflicts continue to prove that a determined, disciplined force, even with inferior technology, can challenge and frustrate a technologically superior opponent. The tools are a force multiplier, but the force that is being multiplied is, and always has been, human discipline. The Longbowmen's Code, therefore, is far more than a medieval artifact. It is a permanent testament to the fact that while our machines evolve, the fundamentals of human excellence are timeless. Hollywood loves a lone hero, a single figure standing against impossible odds, and it's tempting to paint the English longbowman in that same romantic light, a rugged yeoman, alone on a hill, single-handedly turning the tide of battle with his incredible skill. But this image is perhaps the greatest myth of all, a complete misunderstanding of what made these men so formidable. The longbowman was never a solo act. He was a single note in a devastating symphony. His power came not from individual brilliance, but from his perfect integration into a larger, meticulously disciplined system. To see him as a lone wolf is to miss the entire point of the English military revolution. His true genius was his ability to disappear into the collective, to submerge his individuality for the sake of a synchronized volley that could darken the sky. He was a component in a machine, and the machine's power was infinitely greater than the sum of its parts. This leads directly to a second, equally persistent misconception, the belief that their victories were won by the longbow itself. We become fascinated by the weapon, its 6-foot stature, its yew-wood construction, its armor-piercing capability, and we wrongly assign the credit to the tool rather than the tradesman. The longbow was indeed a marvel of medieval engineering, but it was an inert piece of wood without the decades of cultural conditioning and years of brutal training that preceded its use on the battlefield. A powerful bow in the hands of an untrained conscript is useless. It's like handing a modern person the keys to a Formula One car and expecting them to win a race. The bow was the delivery system, but the discipline was the ammunition. The real weapon was the societal infrastructure that produced the archer, the training regimen that hardened him, and the command structure that directed him. Focusing solely on the bow is like crediting a painting entirely to the quality of the brush while ignoring the years of practice, vision, and skill of the artist who wielded it. These myths collectively rob the longbowmen of their true legacy, which was a holistic, all-encompassing philosophy of discipline that touched every aspect of their lives. It wasn't just about standing in a line and shooting when told. It was the discipline to spend every Sunday on the village green since childhood because the law and your community expected it. It was the discipline to meticulously maintain your equipment every night in a muddy camp, even when you were exhausted. It was the psychological discipline to control your breathing and steady your hands when every instinct screamed to run. It was the logistical discipline of the quartermasters who ensured you never ran out of arrows, and the moral discipline to stand by the man next to you because you had sworn an oath to do so. This wasn't a one-dimensional military tactic. It was a deeply ingrained way of life that created soldiers who were resilient, adaptable, and utterly reliable. By dispelling these romanticized notions, we don't diminish their accomplishments. We actually make them far more impressive and relevant. It's easy to chalk up a victory to a super weapon or a few legendary heroes. It feels like magic, a historical anomaly. But when we understand that their success was the result of a reproducible system of culture, training, and psychology, it becomes something we can actually learn from. Their story transforms from a distant legend into a powerful case study in how any group, community, or organization can achieve extraordinary things through a shared commitment to excellence, preparation, and mutual trust. The truth is, their victory was earned, not gifted by a magical bow, and that makes their legacy, built on the unglamorous foundation of sheer hard work, all the more worthy of our admiration and deep respect. Yet for all its legendary power and the unbreakable discipline of those who wielded it, the age of the longbow was ultimately drawing to a close. This decline, however, was not a story of failure or a loss of the very discipline that had made it great. The longbow did not vanish from the battlefield because it was beaten. It was simply rendered obsolete by a force that would change the world forever. the advent of practical gunpowder weapons. This was a technological revolution that fundamentally rewrote the rules of engagement, shifting the paradigm of warfare away from human strength and lifetime skill toward mechanical firepower and a new kind of industrial discipline. The iconic U-bow, which had dominated European battlefields for centuries, gradually gave way to the awkward, unreliable, but ultimately unstoppable arquebus and musket. The key advantage of these early firearms was not their immediate superiority. In fact, in their infancy, guns were inferior in almost every measurable way to the longbow. They were laughably inaccurate, with effective ranges far shorter than a skilled archer's. Their rate of fire was glacial. A trained musketeer might fire 2 or 3 rounds in the time a longbowman could loose 20 arrows. They were dangerously unreliable, prone to misfiring in wet weather, and could even explode in the user's face. But they possessed one transformative quality: they required very little physical strength or lifetime training to operate. The barrier to entry was dramatically lower. A farmer could be taught to load, aim, and fire a musket in a matter of weeks, whereas creating a master longbowman was a generational project. In an era of growing nation-states and increasingly large standing armies, this was a logistical and strategic game-changer. Kings could now raise and equip massive armies relatively quickly, no longer dependent on a deep cultural tradition of archery to supply their primary missile troops. This shift demanded a different form of discipline, one less about individual mastery and more about industrialized collective routine. The drill for a musketeer was a series of rigid mechanical steps, the musket drill, that had to be performed in perfect sequence by long lines of men to produce a rolling volley of fire. It was a discipline of synchronization and reloading under pressure rather than one of accuracy and rapid, independent shooting. The psychological profile changed too. Where the longbowman's courage was rooted in calm focus and emotional control under a terrifying personal assault, the musketeer's bravery was found in the nerve to stand shoulder to shoulder with his comrades in a dense formation, enveloped in thick, deafening smoke, and perform a complex manual task while being charged by cavalry or shot at by the enemy. It was a shift from the discipline of the individual artisan to the discipline of the factory worker on the battlefield. Yet, to think the longbowmen's legacy retired with their weapons is to miss a crucial point. While the tool disappeared, the principles they exemplified became permanently engraved on the heart of military doctrine. The critical importance of coordinated volley fire, which the longbowmen had perfected, became the absolute cornerstone of infantry tactics for the next 400 years, from the Spanish tercios to the lines of Wellington. The concept of using ranged fire to break an enemy's morale and formation before melee contact remained. Only now it was achieved with lead balls instead of arrows. The need for unwavering unit cohesion, mutual trust, and the ability to follow commands under duress, the very soul of the Longbowmen's Code, became even more vital in the age of linear warfare, where a single break in the line could lead to catastrophic rout. Their greatest lesson, that discipline is a weapon system in itself, was learned and applied by every effective army that followed. The disappearance of the longbowman from the ranks, therefore, was not an end but an evolution. It marked the close of an era where a single weapon, powered by human skill and supreme mental fortitude, could dictate the outcome of wars, but the transition powerfully highlights a timeless dynamic, that while technology evolves at a breakneck pace, the fundamental human elements of warfare coordination, morale, and adaptability merely find new expressions. The tools of war change, but the value of the disciplined mind and spirit never does. The longbowmen passed the torch, not to a superior weapon, but to a new generation of soldiers who would need to embody their same unwavering resolve in the face of an even more terrifying and impersonal form of warfare. The principles that elevated the English longbowman from a simple yeoman to a battlefield legend were never really about the bow itself. They were about a fundamental approach to excellence that is just as applicable in a modern office, on a sports field, or in our personal lives today. Their legacy offers a powerful counter-narrative to our contemporary obsession with quick fixes, innate talent, and the latest tools. They teach us that true, lasting success isn't found in a new piece of software, a genetic gift, or a secret shortcut, but is instead forged in the fires of consistent practice, cultivated mental resilience, and a deep commitment to the team. In a world that often prioritizes the flashy and the new, the longbowmen remind us of the enduring power of the basics, executed with unwavering discipline. Consider the concept of consistent practice. The longbowman didn't achieve his devastating rate of fire by practicing only when he felt motivated. His skill was the product of a cultural mandate, of countless hours on the village green in sun, rain, and wind, building not just muscle memory but neural pathways of efficiency. This translates directly to any modern pursuit we wish to master. Whether it's learning a language, coding, playing an instrument, or improving a sales pitch, mastery is never an event. It's a process of daily, incremental improvement. It's the understanding that showing up on the days you don't feel like it, the days equivalent to a longbowman's rainy drill, is what separates the amateur from the professional. This disciplined consistency compounds over time, transforming initial struggle into effortless skill, much like an archer's draw eventually becomes second nature. Perhaps the most resonant lesson is in the realm of mental toughness. The longbowman's greatest weapon wasn't his arrow, but his mind's ability to remain calm and focused while armored knights charged directly at him. He used controlled breathing and visualization techniques we now see in sports psychology and corporate wellness programs to override the primal panic that cripples performance. We face our own modern cavalry charges, a high-stakes presentation, a critical negotiation, a crucial play in a game, or a difficult personal conversation. In these moments, our technical skills are already in place. What determines the outcome is our ability to manage our physiology and psychology. Adopting the longbowman's mindset means training our mental game with the same rigor we train our technical skills, learning to steady our nerves and focus our attention under extreme pressure, ensuring our performance doesn't collapse when it matters most. Furthermore, their example dismantles the myth of the lone genius. No single archer, no matter how skilled, could win a battle alone. Their power was collective, emerging from flawless synchronization and absolute trust in a clear command structure and in each other. This is the absolute essence of modern teamwork in business, healthcare, or any collaborative endeavor. A company's success isn't about having one brilliant coder or a visionary CEO. It's about whether the marketing, design, engineering, and support teams can operate like those staggered ranks of archers, each unit trusting the other to do their part, communicating clearly, and covering for one another's weaknesses. It's about creating a culture where individual egos are subsumed by a shared objective, and where the group's achievement is valued above any individual's glory. Ultimately, the longbowmen's story is a profound lesson in focusing on what we can control. They couldn't control the size of the enemy army, the weather, or the terrain. But they could control their training, their equipment maintenance, their breathing, and their obedience to the unit's signals. In our own lives, we often waste energy fixating on external factors, market conditions, a competitor's advantage, or plain bad luck. Their discipline teaches us to redirect that energy inward, to double down on our preparation, our mindset, and our commitment to our own unit, whether that's our family, our team, or our community. By embracing this ancient code of incremental improvement, mental fortitude, and collective purpose, we arm ourselves with the only true advantage that has ever existed: the unwavering discipline to be prepared, to stand firm, and to perform at our best when the pressure is on. Now let's bring this history out of the past and into your present. Think about your own life for a moment. Where is there a gap between what you want to achieve and where you are right now? That gap, more often than not, is a discipline gap. It's not a lack of desire or even a lack of talent. It's the missing structure of consistent, focused effort. The Longbowmen didn't just pick up a bow one day and become legends. They built their skill brick by brick, hour by hour, over a lifetime. What is the one skill you've been meaning to master, the project you've been putting off, or the healthy habit you just can't seem to stick with? That's your longbow. It's your personal instrument of change, and it's utterly powerless without the daily practice to wield it effectively. Consider the sheer mental fortitude they had to cultivate, that ability to steady their breathing and focus their aim while chaos erupted around them. We all face our own version of that charging cavalry. It might be the overwhelming pressure of a deadline, the anxiety of a difficult conversation, or the constant ping of notifications pulling your focus in a dozen directions. The Longbowmen's strategy wasn't to eliminate the chaos. That was impossible. Their genius was in training themselves to function within it, to create a bubble of intense concentration. How can you build that same mental armor? It might start with just 5 minutes of mindful breathing each morning, or consciously putting your phone away during deep work sessions. It's about creating small, disciplined practices that train your mind to hold its focus, just as they trained their bodies to hold the draw. And let's not forget, they were never in it alone. Their strength was a collective strength, a web of mutual trust and shared purpose. Who is your unit? Who are the people in your life that you rely on, and who rely on you to hold the line? This could be your family, your close-knit team at work, your running club, or your group of friends. Discipline flourishes in a community of accountability. It's easier to get up for that early morning workout when you know your friend is waiting for you. It's easier to stay late to finish a project when you know your colleague is counting on your contribution. We are social creatures, and our discipline is contagious. By surrounding ourselves with people who are also committed to showing up and doing the work, we create an ecosystem where excellence becomes the norm, not the exception. This isn't about a grim, joyless grind. The Longbowmen took profound pride in their craft and their camaraderie. The discipline itself, the mastery of their art, was a source of deep satisfaction and identity. Your own journey should be the same. The goal isn't just the outcome, the promotion, the finished marathon, the fluent new language. The real reward is in the person you become along the way, the more focused, resilient, and reliable version of yourself. That's the true victory, so we'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, tell us about your longbow. What's the one area where you're committing to a new level of discipline? And what's the first small, consistent step you're going to take to draw that bowstring? Your story might be the inspiration someone else needs to start their own journey. The story of the English Longbowmen is far more than a tale of military innovation. It is a timeless testament to the profound truth that the human spirit, when forged in the fires of discipline, can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Their legacy whispers to us across the centuries, a powerful reminder that while the tools at our disposal may evolve with breathtaking speed, from the longbow to the smartphone, from the armored charge to the digital marketplace, the fundamental ingredients of success remain remarkably unchanged. True strength has never resided solely in the technology we wield. but in the depth of our preparation, the clarity of our focus under pressure, and the unwavering commitment we make to those who rely on us. The longbow was merely the instrument. The real weapon was the unbreakable code of conduct that transformed ordinary individuals into an extraordinary force. This ancient code offers a vital lens through which to view our own modern struggles and aspirations. In a world that often celebrates quick fixes, innate talent, and the allure of the newest gadget, the Longbowmen stand as a counterpoint, championing the quiet, consistent power of earned mastery. Their victories were not accidents of birth or luck, but the direct result of choices made every single day on the village green, in the training camp, and in the steadfast decision to hold the line when every instinct screamed to flee. They teach us that our greatest battles are won not in the moment of crisis, but in all the small, unseen moments of preparation that precede it. The discipline to practice when no one is watching, to maintain your equipment, to support your teammate, and to master your own fears. These are the timeless architects of victory, whether on a medieval battlefield or in the pursuit of a personal goal. So as we draw the string on this chapter of history, we invite you to carry this lesson forward. Let the Longbowmen's example inspire you to identify your own longbow, that skill, project, or habit where greater discipline could rewrite your outcome. Share your journey with us in the comments below. We are truly curious to hear how this story of resilience and focus resonates with your life. If you found value in delving into the past to understand the present, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more explorations into the lessons history has to offer. Thank you for watching, and remember, the most powerful force you will ever command is the discipline you choose to cultivate within. If this journey into the disciplined world of the Longbowmen reshaped your view of history, consider showing your support with a like. It truly helps us continue creating content that explores the incredible stories of the past. To make sure you never miss a deep dive, subscribe to our channel and tap that notification bell. We're always working to bring you more fascinating explorations that connect the lessons of history to our lives today. We'd also love to hear your own stories in the comments below. How has discipline shaped your own battles, whether in your career, your personal goals, or your creative projects? Your experiences create a living conversation, and we read every single one. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until our next adventure together, keep drawing your bow with focus, and may your aim always be true.